The subjunctive mood in Latin is used for actions that are either not true, unreal, of a general circumstance, hypothetical, possible but not quite real, or hoped for but may or may not come true. To make things easier, Latin utilizes the subjunctive in only very specific and easily classifiable uses. For example, the result of an action will use the subjunctive mood, as does purpose. Since the subjunctive mood is different from the indicative mood, which is the factual mood that everyone always learns first, the conjugation of verbs into the subjunctive mood will be different. This video covers the conjugation of verbs in the passive voice of the imperfect tense of the subjunctive. The easiest way to think of the passive voice for this tense in the subjunctive is the same as with it in the indicative. We can just swap out the active endings and replace them with the passive ones. So amarent is made passive by exchanging the unt for untur, amarentur. Simple enough, but let's look at this more specifically. I truthfully think that the imperfect subjunctive is the easiest conjugation in Latin, since you just take the second principal part and add your personal endings. So instead of adding the active personal endings, we'll add the passive ones. So the imperfect subjunctive in the passive voice for amo amar is amarer, amareres, amaretur, amaremur, amaremini, amarentur. And it's the same for all verbs. So the imperfect passive subjunctive for duco ducere is ducerer, ducereres, duceretur, duceremur, duceremini, ducerentur. No exceptions, no ifs, no ands, and no buts. Well, almost. What about deponent verbs? Remember that deponents are verbs that look passive but are translated actively. So for us to form the imperfect subjunctive for a verb like conor, conari, conata sum, to try, we take the second principal part, conari, and add the passive endings, but wait, this doesn't look right. Let's rewind just a bit. In my discussion about the imperfect active subjunctive, I told you that the second principal part plus endings was actually a nice little coincidence and a shortcut that we can use. But the imperfect subjunctive for a verb like amaremos is actually the present stem ama plus an s, which illustrates the past tense, and you can compare this to ancient Greek if you know that, or to some Latin verbs like mansit or duxit, where the s sound illustrates the perfect tense, plus an a to show the subjunctive mood, and then the endings. Oh, and the s gets rhoticized into an r because it's in between two vowels, like how the Latin jus, law, becomes juris in the genitive. So for deponent verbs, we need to reconstruct this form. So for conor, we take the present stem, kona, add our s and a, and don't forget to rhoticize the s into an r, and then the passive endings. So we get conarer, conareris, conaretur, etc. So in short, we need to imagine up an active present infinitive for deponents based on the conjugation number, and it's to this imaginary form that we add our passive endings. So for a second conjugation deponent like polikeor, the imperfect subjunctive is polikeretur. For a third conjugation deponent like loquor, the imperfect subjunctive is loqueretur. And for a third IO deponent like morior, the imperfect subjunctive is moreretur. And for a fourth, like orior, the imperfect subjunctive is oriretur. I hope I've been able to elucidate this concept a bit by talking about how the imperfect subjunctive is actually formed. Sometimes it is better to know the reason why rather than just the what in the shortcut. So maybe the passive voice of the imperfect subjunctive isn't the easiest thing ever once you throw deponents into the equation. But overall, it's not too difficult, especially when you consider that deponent verbs in the imperfect subjunctive are really few and far between.